Zara sighed as she wiped down the counter for the third time that morning, her fingers aching from the constant movement. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of regulars nursing their coffee in the corner. The morning rush had passed, leaving behind the scent of burnt toast and freshly brewed espresso. Then the bell above the door jingled, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with dark hair slightly tousled, his suit wrinkled like he'd been through hell and back. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and the deep furrow in his brow made him look like the weight of the world was crushing him. He ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply before making his way to the counter. Zara grabbed a menu, but before she could hand it to him, he muttered, "Just a coffee, black." She hesitated. Something about him, his tired eyes, the tension in his shoulders, made her pause. He looked like a man at his breaking point. "Rough day?" she asked, pouring the coffee into a ceramic mug. He gave a humorless chuckle, something like that. Zara watched as he reached for his wallet, but before he could pull out any cash, she gently pushed the coffee toward him. "It's on the house." His sharp blue eyes flicked up to hers, surprise flashing across his face. "Why?" she shrugged. "You look like you need it." For the first time, something in his expression softened, like her small act of kindness had cracked through whatever armor he was wearing. He wrapped his hands around the mug, staring at the steam rising from the surface. "I don't even know your name," he murmured. "Zara." He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "Felix. Nice to meet you, Felix." He took a sip of his coffee, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes as if savoring the warmth. Zara leaned against the counter, watching him. "Want to talk about it?" she asked. Felix let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Not much to say, just one of those days where everything goes wrong." Zara gave him a knowing smile. "I've had plenty of those." Something about her easy demeanor, the way she spoke to him like he was just another guy instead of someone important, made Felix feel lighter. He had spent the entire morning being yelled at by board members. His company's stock had taken a hit, and to top it all off, his car had broken down. But somehow, sitting here in this tiny diner, drinking a free coffee from a waitress who didn't expect anything in return, everything didn't seem so terrible. He glanced around the space. It was small, cozy, the kind of place that smelled like butter and cinnamon. He couldn't remember the last time he had been somewhere like this. "Do you run this place?" he asked. Zara laughed. "God, no, I just work here." Felix studied her. There was something refreshing about her. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't asking what he did for a living or why he looked like he'd just lost $1 million. She was just kind. "What about you?" she asked. "What do you do?" Felix hesitated for a brief second before saying, "I run a business." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. He was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation, but for some reason, he didn't want to bring that into this moment. Zara raised an eyebrow. "Sounds vague," he smirked. "It's complicated." She shook her head, chuckling. "You rich guys and your mysterious jobs." Felix nearly choked on his coffee. Did she know? But the teasing glint in her eyes told him she was joking. She had no idea who he was, and for the first time in years, he liked that. He stayed longer than he intended, sipping his coffee, letting Zara's laughter and easy conversation chip away at the stress of the day. Eventually, the bell above the door jingled again, and a group of customers walked in, pulling Zara's attention away. Felix took that as his cue to leave. He pulled out his wallet, sliding a crisp $100 bill under his empty mug. When Zara turned back to the counter, she frowned. "Felix, what?" But he was already at the door. He glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for the coffee, Zara." Then he was gone. Zara stared at the bill, shaking her head in disbelief. Who was this man? Zara didn't think much about Felix after he left, other than the absurdity of the $100 bill sitting on her counter. She had half a mind to chase after him and return it, but by the time she stepped outside, he was already gone. Instead, she tucked it into the tip jar, shaking her head. The next morning, the diner was busy again, the usual crowd filling the booths with chatter. Zara moved between tables, balancing coffee refills and plates of pancakes when the bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up right away, too busy grabbing a fresh pot of coffee. But then a familiar voice spoke. "Black coffee." Her head snapped up. Felix stood at the counter, looking slightly less disheveled than the day before, though there was still something tired in his posture. His suit was pressed this time, his tie neatly knotted. He looked more put together, but his eyes still held the same exhaustion. Zara set down the coffee pot, crossing her arms. "Back for another free drink." His lips twitched, something like amusement flickering across his face. "I was hoping for another conversation, actually." She couldn't hide her surprise. "Didn't take you for the type who wanted to chat with a waitress." Felix pulled out a stool and sat. "Maybe I'm full of surprises." Zara poured the coffee, watching him as he wrapped his hands around the mug. He wasn't in a rush to leave this time. "So what's the deal?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "You some kind of coffee snob who only drinks diner brews when life gets hard?" Felix exhaled a quiet laugh. "Something like that." She tilted her head. "You never did tell me what kind of business you run." He took a sip of his coffee. "And you never asked what I was doing before I walked in here yesterday." Zara quirked a brow. "I figured if you wanted to talk about it, you would." Felix studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." The door opened again, letting in a gust of wind as more customers arrived. Zara grabbed a notepad and moved to take their orders, but not before throwing Felix a glance. "Stay as long as you want, but no more $100 tips." She turned away before she could see his reaction, but she could feel his gaze following her as she moved across the diner. For the next hour, Felix stayed, sipping his coffee, occasionally watching her as she bustled around. Zara wasn't sure why, but something about him made her curious. He didn't carry himself like an ordinary businessman. There was something heavier in the way he sat there, something unspoken. Eventually, the late morning lull hit and Zara found herself back at the counter. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, wiping down the surface. Felix shook his head. "No, figured, you have that lost city guy look." He raised a brow. "Lost? You know, like you've been running in circles for so long that you forgot where you were trying to go." Something flickered in his expression, something guarded. "You're not wrong," he admitted. Zara leaned on the counter. "Thought so." Felix studied her, as if trying to decide how much to say. Then, after a pause, he spoke. "I built something from the ground up. Spent years making it successful, and now, no matter how much I do, it never seems to be enough." Zara listened, not interrupting. "I thought success would feel different," he continued, "but instead it just feels like an endless chase." She considered his words. "I think a lot of people feel that way," she said finally. "Like no matter how much they have, they're still searching for something." Felix looked at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "And you?" he asked. "What are you searching for?" Zara hesitated. "I don't know yet, but when I find it, I'll know." Felix nodded as if he understood. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Then Zara glanced at the clock and sighed. "As much as I'd love to keep giving you free coffee, my shift's almost over." Felix reached for his wallet, but she held up a hand. "Put it away." "I meant it, no more $100 tips." He hesitated, then tucked it back into his jacket. As he stood, he met her eyes. "Then let me do something else instead." Zara raised a brow. "Like what?" Felix reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, sliding it across the counter. "If you ever need anything, call me." She glanced at the card. It was simple, just his name and a number. No company logo, no title. She looked back at him. "You don't even know me." Felix held her gaze. "Maybe I'd like to." Then he turned and walked out, leaving her staring after him, the card cool between her fingers. Zara stared at the card Felix had left behind, her fingers tracing the edges absent-mindedly. She had no intention of calling him. What would she even say? Thanks for the cryptic conversation and the unnecessary $100 tip. But something about him lingered in her mind longer than it should have. The next few days passed in a blur of diner shifts and exhaustion. The morning rush, the clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, it was all the same. But every time the bell above the door jingled, her heart jumped just a little. And then, on the fourth morning, he came back. Felix walked in with the same measured confidence, but this time, he wasn't wearing a suit. A dark sweater and fitted slacks replaced the rigid formality, making him look more approachable, though no less commanding. He slid onto the stool at the counter, his gaze meeting hers like he had expected her to be waiting. Zara crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "You sure you don't have anywhere else to be?" A slow, knowing look crossed his face. "I think I like it here," she scoffed, pouring him a coffee without asking. "Don't tell me you come to places like this often." "No," he admitted, fingers wrapping around the mug. "But I think I should have started sooner." Zara shook her head, unable to fight the small smile tugging at her lips. "So what's the real reason you're here?" Felix took a sip of coffee, considering. "You asked me last time what I was searching for." She raised a brow. "And I'm still figuring that out." Zara watched him carefully. There was something intriguing about the way he spoke, like every word was weighed before he let it slip. He wasn't just making conversation, he was testing the air between them, pushing at something unspoken. She decided not to press further. Instead, she grabbed a fresh plate of croissants from behind the counter and slid one toward him. "On the house." Felix exhaled a quiet laugh. "You have a habit of giving things away for free." "Only to people who look like they need it," she shot back. He broke off a piece of the croissant, chewing thoughtfully. "And what about you?" "What do you need?" Zara hesitated. No one ever asked her that. She was always the one making sure everyone else was taken care of, her coworkers, the customers, even her landlord when he needed the rent early. "I don't know," she admitted finally. Felix nodded like he understood. "Maybe you should figure that out too." For a moment, the conversation settled into something quieter, something unspoken. There was no rush to fill the silence, no awkwardness, just an understanding that neither of them quite knew what they were looking for, but somehow they had both ended up here. The door opened again, and Zara glanced up to see her manager waving her over. She sighed. "Duty calls." Felix watched her go, his expression unreadable. But before she turned away completely, he reached into his pocket and slid something across the counter, a small, folded note. Zara frowned but took it, unfolding the paper as he stood to leave. "Dinner tonight if you want to. No $100 tips involved." She glanced back up, but Felix was already heading for the door. He didn't look back. Zara stared at the note, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't explain. Zara wasn't the type to second-guess herself. But as she stood outside the upscale restaurant, staring at the golden lettering on the glass doors, she wondered if she had made a mistake. This was not her world. The place oozed sophistication, from the valet waiting at the entrance to the soft glow of chandeliers spilling onto the sidewalk. The host at the door barely concealed his surprise when she walked in, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the designer-clad patrons sipping wine at linen-covered tables. And then she saw him. Felix was already seated, his gaze locked onto her the moment she stepped inside. He wasn't in a suit this time, but a dark button-down with the sleeves rolled up, the top button undone. He looked at ease, yet the intensity in his eyes told her he had been waiting for her with anticipation he didn't bother hiding. A waiter led her to the table, and as she sat, Felix leaned in slightly, his voice low. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." Zara smoothed her napkin over her lap, meeting his gaze. "Neither was I." His lips curved, but there was something softer about it, something just for her. He poured her a glass of wine from the bottle already on the table, watching as she took a sip. "You look beautiful," he murmured. Zara wasn't easily flustered, but the way he said it like it was a simple fact rather than an empty compliment made warmth creep up her neck. "You clean up well yourself," she shot back, lifting a brow. Felix chuckled, setting his glass down. "I had a feeling you were going to say that." The conversation flowed effortlessly, just like it had in the diner, but this time, something was different. There was no counter between them, no hurried moments stolen between customers. Here, it was just them, with nothing to interrupt the slow unraveling of whatever had been building since that first coffee. Zara learned more about him that night, though she suspected he still held things back. He spoke about his company in vague terms, but she could tell there was more to his story than he let on. And Felix learned more about her too. She told him about the diner, how she had been working there for years, how she had dreams once, though she wasn't sure if she still did. "Why not?" he asked, watching her carefully. Zara hesitated. "I guess life just got in the way." Felix didn't press, but there was something in his expression that told her he understood more than he let on. The night stretched on longer than either of them intended. When the plates were cleared and the wine had been replaced with coffee, neither of them made a move to leave. But eventually, the night had to end. Felix walked her outside, the city humming around them. The air was crisp, the kind that carried the scent of possibility. He turned to her, his hands in his pockets, studying her like he was memorizing the moment. "I don't do this," he admitted. Zara tilted her head. "Do what?" "This. Sit in a restaurant for hours just to talk, lose track of time." His voice was quieter now, more certain. "But with you, I didn't want to leave." Something inside her shifted. She had spent so long being the one who listened, the one who gave without expecting anything in return. But Felix, he wasn't just taking. He was offering something in return, even if he didn't know how to say it outright. She could have walked away then, let the night end with a polite goodbye. But instead, she stepped forward, looking up at him beneath the streetlights. "Then don't," she whispered. Felix didn't hesitate. He reached for her, his hand brushing against her waist, pulling her in just enough to make her breath hitch. And then, with the city alive around them, he kissed her slow, deep, like he had been waiting for this moment since the first cup of coffee she had placed in front of him. And maybe, in some way, she had been waiting too. The city lights blurred as Zara walked beside Felix, her pulse still thrumming from the kiss. The evening air was crisp against her skin, but she barely noticed. Everything felt heightened: the sound of distant traffic, the glow of street lamps, the quiet space between them that buzzed with something unspoken. Felix led her toward a waiting car, sleek and understated, the kind that screamed wealth without needing to. He opened the door for her without a word, his fingers brushing hers briefly as she slid inside. The warmth of his touch lingered. The ride was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the space. Zara stole a glance at Felix, watching as he stared out the window, his jaw tight. There was something on his mind, something he hadn't said yet. She turned slightly toward him. "You're thinking about something." Felix exhaled through his nose, his gaze shifting to her. "I am." Zara waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say mattered. He hesitated before finally speaking. "There's something I should have told you earlier." Her stomach tightened slightly, but she forced herself to stay steady. "All right." Felix's fingers tapped lightly on his thigh before he met her eyes fully. "I should have told you who I was from the start." The weight of his words settled between them. Zara blinked, trying to piece together what he meant. "You already told me you run a business," she said carefully. Felix let out a quiet breath. "It's more than that, I own it. The company, the board, the entire operation, it's mine." Realization dawned slowly. She had suspected he was successful, but this was something else entirely. "You're the CEO," he nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes," Zara let that sink in. It explained a lot: the exhaustion, the way he carried himself, the crisp bandnotes he left behind like they meant nothing. He wasn't just some businessman grabbing coffee before work. He was one of those powerful names people whispered about, the kind of man who had the world at his feet. And yet, he had spent nights in a diner talking to her. Zara studied him, searching for any sign of arrogance, any trace of the entitlement men like him usually carried. But there was none. If anything, he seemed almost wary, as if waiting for her to react, to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. Is that why you kept coming back? Felix's brows furrowed. What do you mean? She shrugged, her voice even. Because I didn't know who you were. Because for once you weren't the CEO, you were just some guy having a bad day. Something flickered in his expression, something raw, maybe a pause. But that's not why I stayed. Zara held his gaze, her heartbeat unsteady. Felix leaned in slightly, his voice quieter now. I stayed because of you. The words settled deep, unraveling something inside her. She could have pushed him away, could have let the weight of his world overshadow whatever this was. But the truth was, she didn't care about his title, his money, or the power that came with it. She cared about the man who had walked into her diner, tired and frayed, and found something worth lingering for. Zara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Okay, Felix studied her as if waiting for more. Okay, she nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. I don't care who you are, Felix. I just care about who you are with me. Something in his posture eased, the tension in his shoulders loosening. He reached for her hand, his fingers warm against hers. And for the first time since stepping into his car, Zara knew this was just the beginning. The city skyline stretched beyond the tinted windows, neon lights flickering against the darkened glass as Felix's car moved steadily through the streets. Zara's fingers rested lightly against her knee, her mind still spinning from the revelation of who he truly was. She wasn't naive, she had known Felix wasn't an ordinary man. But knowing and understanding were two different things. Felix hadn't let go of her hand since she'd accepted the truth of who he was, and for some reason, that small gesture grounded her more than anything. It was a silent reassurance, as if he was afraid that if he let go, she might slip away. The car came to a gentle stop outside a towering building, its sleek architecture shimmering under the glow of the city lights. Zara glanced up, taking in the sheer height of it. The place exuded wealth, not just in its grandeur, but in the way it seemed separate from the world around it, untouchable. Felix turned to her. I know this is a lot, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't expect you to, I'm here, aren't I? She interrupted, her gaze steady. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of something deeper. Without another word, he stepped out of the car and came around to open her door. The moment she stepped out, the city felt distant, muffled by the quiet luxury of their surroundings. He led her inside, past a lobby that was more art than architecture, and into a private elevator that whisked them upward. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it was charged with something unsaid, something waiting. When the doors slid open, Zara found herself stepping into a world she had never known. Felix's penthouse wasn't just expensive, it was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline like a masterpiece. The space was sleek but warm, with subtle signs of someone who lived there, an open book on the coffee table, a half-empty glass of whiskey on the bar. Zara turned in a slow circle, absorbing it all before settling her gaze back on Felix. And you still kept coming to that diner, she murmured. His lips pressed together, something unreadable passing through his eyes. It was never about the place. She knew that now. Felix moved toward the bar, pouring himself a drink before hesitating. Would you like something? Zara shook her head. She wasn't interested in whiskey or wine. She was interested in the man standing before her, the one who had spent days sipping black coffee in a diner when he could have been anywhere else. She crossed the room, stopping just short of him. What now, Felix? He exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. That depends. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her skin. On whether you're willing to see where this goes. Zara searched his face, seeing something rare and unguarded in his expression. Felix wasn't a man used to uncertainty. He was used to control, to knowing the outcome before he even made a move. But with her, there was no certainty. And yet, he was still standing here, waiting. She placed her hand over his, holding it against her cheek for a moment before pulling it away. I don't care about your money, Felix. I don't care about your penthouse or your company. I know. His voice was rough, like he had been waiting for her to say those words. But I do care about you. Felix's breath hitched, his grip tightening slightly. Then stay. Zara didn't need time to think. She had already made her choice. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down into a kiss that was neither rushed nor hesitant. It was an answer, a promise, a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Felix didn't feel like he was chasing something he could never catch, because she was already here.